Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
Hello, Pete. Can you hear me?
Shan, I can, brother. Good morning, my friend. How are you?
Yeah, good, mate. Really good. It must be early in the morning for you.
It is 5:30 a.m. So, I usually get up around this time.
Okay.
What?
I'm usually rolling over and thinking, oh, is it day one?
Yeah, what the fuck is that boy doing at 5:30 a.m.?
It sounds like you're pretty motivated, mate. I had a look at your site and all the stuff you get up to. So,
No, mate.
yeah, I'm
It's
terribly
these
surprised.
conversations and things like this are
Information.
really, really important to me, and I'm very, very interested in trying to, just share them with as many people as possible. I'm so conscious that we are losing the opportunity day by day. That I don't want to lose these opportunities. People are retiring so quick these days, and we're going to miss these opportunities. So, I really, really appreciate your time, and I always want to make sure we try and do a great job with these.
Okay. I'm a bit nervous, actually.
No, don't be bloody daft, mate. You don't, and I know that's a secret compliment because, like, you could do this standing on your head. I'm really fascinated to get into our conversation and talk about like the places you've gone, the people you've spoken to, and kind of why this whole thing got started. Really, I mean, so if we could just start with like a little whistle stop tour of where you're from, and then we'll kind of get into the background of the career.
Okay, so I'm from Brisbane, Australia, state of Queensland. I joined the fire service in 1983, and I served 38 years in the fire service, mostly in Brisbane, and recently retired about a year ago.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. Just retired. So, I mean, that must have been, let's kind of start there, I suppose. That must have been a surreal time because 38 years is probably what most people are going to be looking at these days. I've done 18 years so far. I'm 33, so I'm probably going to do another 25 or something years. But, gone are the days where people are just doing 25 years. Congratulations on your retirement, and kind of how does it feel moving into this next big chapter of life?
It feels great. The timing was right for me. Another guy said to me, "Oh, Shan, why don't you hang on for 2 more years and get 40 years up?" But I'm thinking, no, I've had enough. I turned 60, actually 61 when I retired, and so I really wanted to have enough energy and enough time left to be able to pursue my passion of the compartment fire behaviour training. And I thought, time's ticking away. If I stay another couple of years, I could go to 65. But if I do that, then I'm not going to have, it's going to be a little bit old, a little long in the tooth. We're wearing breathing apparatus and crawling around and sort of, burning shipping containers.
Mate, I find it incredible that you're able to continue to go to that age, because I honestly think that you're one of those great examples of somebody that's probably kept a good eye on your physical health and well-being over those years. Because when I look at some of the lads and lasses in their 20s and 30s now, I'm not sure they'll still be able to do that in 25 years. How have you found your body kind of changing, moving into that later stage of your career? And you've obviously, you stay in shape, you've been able to keep doing it.
Yeah, well, it doesn't get any easier, that's for sure. I must admit that in the later part of my 50s, say 58, 59, everything started to feel heavier. The coil of hose felt heavier. The 64 felt heavier. Everything, felt heavier. But, I still find I can do everything that I used to do, but obviously I've got to pace myself and be careful, and got a few little injuries here and there. My knee was one that played up for me earlier in the year. It's an old injury, but I've sort of tried to stay reasonably active. I mean, nowhere near as active as what you are, nowhere near as fit as what you are. But
Yeah, but you've got
my younger
25 years
days.
on me, so I don't think I'm going to make it to where you are. This is what I'm saying. Sorry to interrupt, but like,
mm,
being fit and healthy in your 20s is bullshit. Do you know what I mean? Everyone's fit and healthy in
mm,
their 20s, and then in their 30s, it's kind of here and there, and then 40s, 50s, a lot of people drop off and land on the graveyard of, oh, I used to be a fit firefighter, and then you're like,
yeah,
well, what happened? You know, because you're still in the
yeah,
job and you're 50 or whatever. So it's like,
yeah.
blowing smoke up your ass a little bit, but you must have been thinking about this 10 years ago, maybe like, well, I'll tell you what, I need to start thinking a little bit sharper about this.
I've always been motivated to train. Like in my younger years, I did powerlifting, then briefly did some Olympic weightlifting. And so I've always enjoyed training of weights. So I've maintained quite a good level of strength over the years. Never been one that was terribly fit. I've tried running, I've tried aerobic type activities, and while I improve, I just, obviously I'm meant for strength, not for endurance, but I've tried to overlap with those. And I think consistency is a big thing. I've
Yeah.
really trained all my life and nowhere near as frequently as I should be, but I suppose I try to get in, do some weights 3 to 4 times a week.
Mm.
I try to do some, walk a couple of kilometres 2 or 3 times a week. And I think consistency is a big thing, Pete. You
Yeah.
can't at any stage say you can't rest on the fitness level you had even months ago. If you don't do something to
Mm.
maintain your strength and to maintain your fitness, you lose it very rapidly. So
I
these
always say
days,
with
they're very short workouts, but they are consistent.
yeah, it's just consistency. I was talking to somebody yesterday and I said to them, it wasn't all my phrase, it's something I heard many, many years ago. I was saying, don't be good, be the enemy of great. Don't let, just because it wasn't a perfect workout, just because you weren't feeling incredible, don't let that stop
Yeah,
you from just getting in there and getting it done. You just got to keep
exactly
showing
right.
up. And I often think about that with a podcast. I always call it learning out loud. I fumble through some of these conversations. I speak with people like yourself who are far more knowledgeable than
Yeah.
me. And I'm like, I know I'm not going to get it right. I'm not going to know as much as these people. It's not going to be perfect. I'm going to interrupt. We're going to stumble. I'm going to, but that's life. Do you know what I mean? And this is
Yeah,
why I
well, that's
think these
right.
conversations are so important. It's not got to be
Mm,
perfect. It's about your intention.
mm,
So when it comes to
yeah.
fitness, your intention is, I'm just trying to stay fit and healthy. I'm just trying to do the best I can with what I've got. It's not going to be
Mm,
perfect.
mm,
And I suppose that kind of brings me to the whole analogy of instructing and learning and stuff like that. But I didn't want to move on before
mm.
I asked you about like what is the expectations of firefighters in Brisbane these days? What's the sort of age ranges? When are people expected to work till, and what are they expected to do operationally in their 50s?
Well, really, they're actually increasing the retirement age in Australia. I mean, I could have gone at 59 and picked up my full pension, but would have had to pay tax on it. So at 60 was the magic number for most of us.
Okay.
But 65 is a mandatory age. You have to retire at 65, but they're talking about pushing it up to 67. And
Wow.
there's no, yeah, it's crazy when you think about it. And there's no special allowances for firefighters, and they're not really taking that into account. So if you're 63 or 64, or you want to go to the wire at 65, then you're either going to be operational or you're going to look for a day work position or a position where you're in a senior management role.
Mm.
And not everybody aspires to that for starters.
No. Yeah.
There's only so many day work positions. So, there's an issue.
I know when
It's
I first joined, it was a bit of a people used to try and carve out positions on crews, on watches, where the old hand or the old sweat would mostly just drive. But in this day and age, we can't really get away with doing that. So, but I do
no,
kind of understand, just to flip that side of the coin from the government's perspective, everybody is living older now. We are living longer. And it's the idea of having to pay people's pensions for 20, 25 years or something like that. But I do think firefighting sits in a very funny little strange little spot whereby the realistic expectations of the job and how many people are going to be able to deliver that. So this is why, certainly for
yeah.
myself, I've shifted a lot of my training, a lot of my lifestyles, a lot of my habits, because you've really got to start stretching out that mindset. You can't just chop and change the
Mm,
body, in your 40s or your 50s if you fucked it up. And this is something that I really love, and I want to be able to do it for that length of time. But when you look across the service and your colleagues and
mm,
stuff like that, is the appetite that that this is a good thing? Is there any concerns about people's health, or are people happy to keep doing it? Because actually, the fire service is one of those strange things. I mean, you alluded to it in what you're going to be doing after you've retired. It's one of those sectors that even though when people retire, a lot tend to stick around anyway. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think you find that with a lot of other jobs. I think that's a
Yes.
good reflection of how passionate people are about this as a thing that they do for their career. I wanted to jump in and just speak to you about a real ugly truth that despite the fact we are trying so hard, we get way too many messages and emails about mental well-being and mental health. And I recently came across something I think is going to be a real game changer. It's called Genesis. Now, this is really different because it's actually human-led mental and social well-being. It's not just an app somewhere that no one's ever going to use. They provide human-led, regular bite-sized approaches. I'm talking 15 minutes a time, using language in a structured learning approach to create safe spaces for teams to have these conversations. And they've got a whole bunch of free workshops coming up online. First one is the 23rd of February, and it's built around sleep and performance with Dr. Martin Jones as a human performance and sleep specialist. You can find all this in the link to the podcast. Another thing I'd specifically say looking at is their 90-day program, which has been designed exclusively for wellbeing leaders in the police and fire and rescue sectors. It actually gives you some tangible tools to have these structured conversations so we can genuinely start to reduce burnout, absenteeism, and general poor mental health. It's not just a tick box, guys. So scroll down, have a look in the notes to this podcast. The first one is on the 23rd of February. I'm going to be there. And the reason I'm actually going to attend something like this versus other stuff is because it's human-led. It's actually going to be real people talking in a way that I can relate to, and it's easy to implement with my team. So hopefully I'll see you there.
Yeah, look, I think we take it in stride. Most of the guys, over their 60s, and the ladies too, over their 60s are able to, pace themselves. And generally, there's a mixture of crews. You don't get people all the same age. The guys tend to take care of themselves reasonably well. There's a few exceptions where, you really need to put them driving the pump and, not get them involved in the pointy end of things. But surprisingly enough, most people are able to cope into their early 60s.
So you joined back in '83. Just give us a little bit of an understanding of, because I want to go into sort of what happened when you started, the early startings of your career, and then some of the big incidents around, 94, 96 that really changed your perspective. But what was it like when you joined? What would basic training have been like? And how did the fire service look in the '80s back in Brisbane?
Yeah, well, I was very military, actually. Looking back, I used to be a greenkeeper. I was working on bowling greens, and I'd been doing that for a couple of years, and I had a nice club that I was working at, and I was quite happy there. And being a greenkeeper, it's rather solitary. There's just yourself and your assistant.
Yeah.
Get the greens ready, and, you're outside all the time. And I was basically my own boss. And then I decided to join the fire service, and I joined, and I think it was around about week 3. We're doing drills in the yard, and it's repetitious, up and down, your dry hose, dragging this, dragging that, people yelling at you, whistles blowing. I'm thinking, what have I done? I've gone from one extreme to the other. And I must admit, the first couple of weeks, I'm thinking, oh boy, what have I done? But I think by the 3rd week, I said, no, look, I do like this, and it's going to be my profession, and I'm going to do it for the rest of my career. So,
did you know anybody already in the
well.
job? What was the motivation to even join?
Well, I didn't really know anybody, but I did know the deputy chief of the Brisbane Fire Brigade back then, which is always a big help. And Don Christensen, Prickle, we used to call him, he was an avid lawn bowler. So I met Don through my greenkeeping, and I was quite well respected by him, and it was mutual. And a couple of my friends had spoken about the fire service and what a good job it is, and et cetera, et cetera. And I got talking to Don about it, and he said, well, there's an intake coming up soon. You should put in for it. So I applied and was successful, and I never looked back. It's been a fantastic career. No
How long was
whatsoever.
the full intake that been then? What was the training like? Was it 12, 18 weeks? And what sort of stuff did you cover?
Well, back then it was 12 weeks. And I was actually the first crew not to be trained in the Bailey ladder, which took 2 weeks off. Remember the old wheeled escapes, the Bailey ladders?
Yeah.
It was a real skill to operating those. So I was the first group that didn't do that. That took 2 weeks off our recruit training. But the first 6 weeks were dragging dry hose. We drag dry hose backwards and forwards, doing all these case drills and learning the equipment before we even actually put water through the hose. Whereas today we get start using water a lot earlier on in the piece, but the idea was to get you thinking along the way of those drills, so each person knew their respective roles like the back of your hand before you started adding other elements of complexity. But very, rather quite strict and military and demanding. It was full on, and you were a nobody back then. And even when you came up on shift, there was the senior hands table. You didn't dare sit there because you had to sit there. Wow. Well, that's gone now. I tell you, it's a very different job. But there was a pecking order, and and in some ways it was good. There was respect for the senior firefighters. They had been there for many years, of course, and had certain privileges. But it was pretty much a rank-based thing. There was quite a division between the firefighter ranks and the officer ranks. They tended to be more divided then, but certainly that's changed now. It's all homogenous.
What was
really
the first
that sort of
station that you joined on? Where was the first place that you worked, and sort of what the size of the teams and the watches over there, just so people get an understanding, because there is a bit of variation across different countries about sizes of stations and layouts of services.
Yeah, well, that's an important question, because when I joined, the expectation was that the recruits would go to Kent Place or Roma Street. They were the two headquarter stations, both in the city, and we had relatively large crews, so we'd have one officer and 5 firefighters.
Okay.
So 1 and 3 were the experienced senior hands, and as a junior firefighter, you fulfilled role 2 or role 4. So it was on-the-job training, and you would be turning out with these characters. You'd be going to real fires, and you'd be backing them up. So they would grab you by the scruff of the neck and say, "You're coming in with me," or sometimes they do the opposite. Say, "No, you're not going in there. Come back in." That'd be stupid. So you had this on-the-job training, and they were busy. There was really busy stations, and during the early 80s, right to the mid 80s, we're getting lots of fires. We've got a lot of opportunity to practice the trade of structural firefighting. Around about probably the late 80s, they restructured, because what we'd had was these big crews in the headquarters stations, and you'd have 2 pumps and a flyer. You'd have about 25 people who could roll out of each station in the headquarters there. But you get to the outstations, and theoretically the crewing was 1 officer and 3 firefighters. But quite often if someone was sick, they wouldn't replace them. So a lot of the stations were running with 1 and 2.
Wow.
And so they said,
even back then, because we do see that a little bit in certain places now, when people hear that and they're like, it would always used to be a minimum crewing of 5 when I joined. Yeah.
Well, then that all changed. And the positive was that we got 1 and 3 for a while. When we decentralised and we sent the younger guys out to the outstations, it took away that apprenticeship. That was the negative side of things. Okay. And you've got people that have done their recruit training and gone, straight from that very regimented military type, highly disciplined period into the outstation life. It was quite a contrast. So that's a negative side of it. And we had some numerous industrial battles over time, and I think it was probably not till the mid-90s that we really had a firm policy on 1 and 3 being minimum crewing, and that meant that they had to then, if it dropped down to 1 and 2, they'd have to recall somebody, do overtime, whatever had to be done to maintain their crewing. So obviously that's an expensive proposition, but it wasn't until the mid-90s we won that battle, and it's very rare these days to go below 1 and 3, but that's the crew size right through all the stations. Even headquarters is still just 1 and 3.
So back then, what was the considerations around, like, this would be like, might sound like a boring question, but safe systems of work around things like structural firefighting? I mean, it's ultimately one of the most dangerous things that we do, with the exception of things like rope rescue and stuff like that. Structural firefighting is where you really need to have a safe system of work around you in terms of pump operators, incident command, entry control officers, things like that. What was the expectations of those crews that were riding just 3 and their capability to do certain systems of work when they arrived at incidents?
In the early stages, it was very unstructured. You'd arrive at a job, the first pump would start operating from the front of the structure, the second pump would roll up, the opposite would say, oh, gee, I think we probably need to have a line on the right-hand side or the left-hand side. So as each crew arrived, they all did their own thing. It's like Lego blocks. They built onto what was done before, and sometimes it worked out all right. Sometimes it was a disaster. So there was no clear incident command structure at that point in time. Now, I was towards the end of that real firefighters for real firemen don't wear BA era. And it was just starting to become aware of the fact that a lot of our colleagues were, getting to retirement age, turned 60, and 2 years later were going to their funeral. They've died of cancer. So we were starting to put two and two together very slowly and realising that this wasn't a very healthy thing to be not wearing breathing apparatus. And
did they have sorry to interrupt? Did they have sets on all the rigs though? Did they have a couple of sets or 4 sets?
Well, that's a good point, because when I came in, I wasn't actually trained in breathing apparatus. That 3 months was just your basic firemanship type skills.
Okay.
And then you had another 3 months probation. Your name was still in pencil by then. They wouldn't say that. They said you've just got to behave yourself for the next 3 months, and then you do the BA training.
Okay.
Well, the problem with that is, well, you can imagine what the problem with that is. And very early on in my career, I ended up at a major fire, chemical fire, Chem Air it was called, and big joint with a lot of agricultural chemicals in there. And I recognised some of the chemicals from my greenkeeping days. And, it would use fungicides and herbicides and insecticides, and like parathion is one of those ones, a couple of drops in a glass of water will kill you. And I was recognising all these toxic chemicals around, and I wasn't allowed to wear breathing apparatus. So consequently, I got sick, and I was living on bananas and Weet-Bix for about 3 or 4 weeks. I got ulceration started my lips, went through my gums, my throat. I was really sick. I believe I got mercury poisoning from that particular job. So that took me about 3 or 4 months to recover from that. And then I was allowed to do my breathing apparatus training. Well, that's changed now. So that is part of the recruit course when they come out. They're obviously qualified to wear breathing apparatus. But back then, I think it was pretty common to only have 2 sets on the truck anyway. Wow. It was a couple of years later before we actually got 4 BA sets on the appliance. And some of the older station officers were a little bit funny about letting you wear a breathing apparatus. I can remember one chap, I won't mention his name, we used to call him Psycho, obviously for obvious reasons. It was the job be going nice, and he'd roll up and he'd go psycho and start waving his arms about and screaming.
Love it.
We'd been in this job. I just put this, I think I was wearing my second set. I'd just gone inside, taken about a dozen breaths, and his Psycho's run inside the building. Wait, take them off, you don't need them now. And he'd run into the middle of this building. The smoke wasn't super thick, but it was dirty. It was filthy, putrid smoke.
Yeah.
He's gone 50 metres inside the building to tell me and my colleague to get outside and get those things off. You don't need them anymore. It is possible to breathe in there. So
what was the aversion
that
to
old
them?
generation.
Were they just expensive to refill, or people thought it was a ball ache? Just if you used them, you'd have to clean them and make them up again, or what?
It was a macho thing. It was the mark of a good firefighter was how much smoke you could eat.
Wow.
And the guys that were admired the most, get to be number one on the branch, were guys that were able to take a lot of punishment, go inside and suck up smoke, and that were held in very high esteem. Now, by 83 and 84, a lot of those guys were dying young when they just get out of retirement. A year or two later, they're dead. So we were gradually starting to work out that that's probably not the way to go for the future, but there was still a bit of a carryover from those days. And yeah, I mean, it's insane, isn't it? I just put the set on. I'd only been breathing it for a couple of minutes. Get them off. You don't need those. Get them off. So we went and then really even overhaul. Now we don't even go inside if it's even when there's no smoke. If we're overhauling, we'll put a set on.
Yeah.
So I was exposed to a little bit of that during that era, but we gradually got there. A bit slow to learn, aren't we? We tend to learn the hard way in the fire service.
So when you did actually go and do your initial breathing apparatus training, your structural firefighter training, what did it entail? Because I know, when we get onto it, we'll talk about the big arc of learning that you went through and some of the
Mm.
unfortunate incidents that you attended. But back then, what was the interpretation of, what was expected when people would put on BA that they would take a line in? What sort of training did you go through for your BA, and how long would it have been?
It was pretty arduous because we were recruits and we were new to the job. It was once again like boot camp all over again. And I think it was a 2 week course. And I think the last 3 or 4 days, we were actually wearing the Proto Mark 5, the regenerative oxygen sets.
Okay.
There was 3 or 4 days of that as well. And we had a
What was in the long
simulated
duration
ship's
ones
hull.
that people used to use in the mines and stuff, the regenerative ones with the
Mm.
crystals in that used to be able to wear for long duration?
The,
It's those ones.
the Proto Mark 5, I think it dates back to the 1950s. And a funny story. Um, I'd done a refresher. They'd taken them out of mothballs. They bought all the old protos from around Australia, and I think I did a refresher in about 94. It was the last crew to do a refresher. And I went over to, happened to be in London, and I dropped in the London Fire Brigade Museum there, and this guy showing me around. He said, "Oh, yes, it's a Proto Mark 5." And I said, "Yeah, I did a refresher on those about a month ago." And the look he gave me, like, I don't think you believe me. And it was sitting in the museum. And I said, when did you decommission? I said, about 20 years ago. Uh,
Fucking
so,
hell.
uh, but, but yeah, um, and then the last exercise was a do or die, and it was very arduous, and it was meant to sort the men from the boys. They'd put you in the ship's hole, they'd fill it full of smoke and heat as well, very hot conditions. And if you've never worn a rebreather, they're really hard to wear because after a while, all the carbon dioxide's
Yeah.
being taken out by the absorbent, your metabolic heat's building up, and you're inhaling this hot oxygen.
Yeah, I
And
wore
it's,
one for a mines rescue training course about 12 years ago, and it was very, very different, very surreal, and quite an uncomfortable. Yeah, like you said, it was quite uncomfortable to breathe because it progressively
yeah,
it starts to warm up towards the end of the
hotter and
wear, and
hotter.
it
Yeah.
was weird. I didn't like it, to be honest.
It's exhausting. Just even even sitting down and just breathing that hot air, well, it's oxygen. Breathing that hot oxygen through is in itself exhausting. So that was a real do or die, and people, be down to the wire. They're just about be fainting and passing out, and but you
Real
had to
men,
keep going
real
because if you
men.
didn't, you get scrubbed.
Fucking
You get scrubbed, or you get sacked.
Jesus.
So it was pretty arduous back then.
So, what was the actual like fire behavior aspect of it when we think about reading the fire and the
Well,
situations and understanding, mechanics and airflow and pathways and stuff like that? Was there anything into that, or where was their level of knowledge of those sort
nothing.
of those conditions?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay.
Our live fire training back then consisted of a visit to the Ampol refinery, where they would light up a couple of petrochemical fires, and we'd light up and light back, and that was live fire training. And you usually that the recruits would do it. If you're lucky, you might get a chance once or twice in your career over the next 10 years to do it as well. So there was virtually no live fire training at all. I think around about 92, 93, we had our academy, and we had a couple of props, external props. There was a car, an LPG bullet, a couple of really simple external
Hmm.
gas-fired props, and that was live fire training.
Right.
And I cut my teeth on the British manuals of firemanship. They
Mhm.
were our textbooks, and I still think they're a fantastic textbook. Obviously, a little bit out of date now, but so we based very British. So all of the systems that we used were based off that British system. It was a very good system,
That's pretty
but there
much a
was practically
global
nothing
approach,
about.
but that also makes me quite
Mm,
sad because I don't think we've made, and this is going to be really harsh. We have made lots of steps forward, but we seem to have rested on our laurels a little bit when I look at the global landscape of
mhm.
certainly fire behavior training and other aspects of the sector.
Oh,
But sorry, I interrupted you. But yeah, like that is where a lot of
yeah,
the origins of a lot of global fire services came from. But I don't know if it was a
yeah.
bit of our ego or a bit of our elitism. I don't know. I try to understand the more I speak to different people, but yeah, it came from there, but then it feels like yourselves and the Swedish and I mean the French are doing some incredible things, seem to have taken some much more significant strides forward since then.
Yeah, well, we ended up developing our own curriculum, and as part of when I did my study tour in the UK and Sweden, '97, I had to review the curriculum. I think there was two paragraphs, a paragraph for flash over and a paragraph for backdraft, and whoever written them got the definitions mixed up. that's
Okay.
that's how bad it was. That's how bad it was. But look, the UK were doing some fantastic things particularly in the mid to late '90s. So really, some phenomenal work coming out of there, and it all goes back to Krista Gisselson in Sweden in the mid 1970s, because he was one of the few people that would look at things and say, well, why are we doing this? And he basically went through their materials and said it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. And he actually rewrote the whole thing. And that itself is a fascinating story. I could talk for hours about how they developed their process, and what a terrible price Krista paid for being a revolutionary. But by the mid '80s,
that's often the case, though, isn't it? With so many things, like they say,
yeah.
a lot of behaviors or a lot of processes progress at the rate of funerals, is what I heard a long time ago. And they say that with science sometimes. It's only when that person retires or dies that some people actually let go of those beliefs, and they have the sort of fortitude and assertiveness to go, fucking hell, I can't remember why we were doing that for so long, but he's gone now, so let's actually bring things up to speed.
It's a funny story with Krista. And that's Rosanda tells a story how Krista's been getting in trouble at the National Academy there because he's teaching stuff that's not in their curriculum, and so he's in the bad books anyway. And Krista was a very down the line guy. He'd tell you exactly what he thought. If you asked him, he'd tell you. So apparently the new commandant there, he'd written a book on firefighting. And they're doing a bit of a morning session there, toolbox talk, and pass the book around and say, what do you think of it? Oh, yeah, it's a pretty good boss, a pretty good chief, And they've all gone around, and Krista said nothing. And he said, Krista, what do you think about it? He says, well, there are two things about this book that's correct. The date it was written and the name of the author. The rest is bullshit.
Fucking hell.
So that's Krista.
Love him. Gotta love it. So it would have been the early 90s, wouldn't it? I'm just trying to think, because you'd have been in for around 10 years then. And it was around that period where you probably started finding your feet and growing in your confidence. But I wanted to try and visit, before I forget about it, those two kind of incidents that really lit a fire under your conviction to try and learn a little bit more about this. If you could take us back to '94, I've seen you write about it before. I've read a couple of articles around some of the tragic incidents that you attended, and if you could talk us through what happened and why that viscerally sort of made you want to go off and have this big adventure and become an instructor yourself.
Well, I think by that stage I'd been starting to question. There was a void in our training, and for the previous 4 years, from '89, actually for most of my career, I was looking outside for those answers to those questions. And go to a fire, and we'd come back, and something weird's happened. I'd say to one of the fireys, what just happened then? He said, oh, it was this, it was that. I'd ask somebody else, and they'd say something different. Man, it was quite clear we didn't really know what was happening. We were experiencing these events. We couldn't predict them. We couldn't name them. And we were getting all these close calls. So 1994, there was a fire in a Honda dealership in Southport, just south of Brisbane. It wasn't a particularly large building. If you see the building, it's probably only about, lucky if it's 20 metres by 15 metres. It had a bit of a basement area there. And there was a fire in there. And it must have been deep-seated, you can imagine, with parts and rubble and concealed fire. So there's two firefighters in there. There's some flare up of the fire that's observed, and the guys have been missed. They've sent another crew in to find them, and they have also been caught in a fire event. And there was almost two more people killed at that particular fire. So there's these two some events, and two of our colleagues died, Herbie Fennell and Noel Watson. We lost them in that fire, and that was 94. And so everyone's asking yourselves, why? Why did this happen? And people had different ideas and different theories. And so we'll wait to see what the coroner says. It usually takes about 2 years before the coroner finishes the investigation, and they've got unlimited time frames. They can call experts from anywhere and everywhere. So we waited very patiently for the coroner's report to come out. And when I read it, I was so disappointed. The coroner talks of some phenomenon of fire which would have produced enough heat to burn these guys to the point where they became rendered unconscious. But he couldn't name the phenomenon of fire. He couldn't say whether that's what killed them. I thought, this is dreadful. I mean, in the whole of the country, there's nobody that can come up and say, well, what happened was this, and that's what killed them. There was nobody could actually do that. And I thought, that's appalling. It's not good enough for two people to die and not know exactly what that phenomenon, some phenomenon of fire was. So that really fired me up. And
do you think there was just a romantic aspect of people thinking, look, Shan, it's just a dangerous job. This is just what we do, and that's the cost we have to pay sometimes? Because there can be a romantic aspect to that when people like to believe that, you know, we're never going to understand it, you know, the big red beast, blah, 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 and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, look, there's definitely an element of that. But a lot of it's just ignorance. And there were some things that went wrong at that fire. And if you look at any fatal fire, there's the 3B, command, control, communications. There are all issues with those. And we got thermal imaging cameras out of it, and we got each firefighter had a radio. So we tightened up on our BA control procedures. So there was half a dozen things that came out of that were positive. And I thought, that's great, but that's not the key issue. The key, the reason these things fail was because of this event. And if we can't prevent more of those events, these other things aren't going to save people. So that really had me fired up. So for this time, I'm putting together a bit of a plan. I'd read about the Swedes and what they were doing. Actually made contact with a fellow called John Taylor, who was a real true pioneer in the UK in the early 90s. John did some fantastic work. He was a great mentor, and he helped me put together some plans to learn more about this. So I've been talking about this since 94. 96 comes along, and there's another event. This time in a backpackers hostel in Rockhampton, which is 6-7 hours north of Brisbane. It's a fairly rural, small town there. So what's happened this time around is there's two firefighters searching a part of the hostel that's not involved in fire. So part of it is involved in fire, this part's not. So they're just clearing each room. So they've gone down a corridor and doing a progressive search as they go through. So what they said is that before the event that hit them, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. So the conditions, it wasn't particularly hot. There was light grey smoke there, but really nothing. It could have been, wearing a t-shirt and a pair of shorts.
Okay.
And then suddenly this event has occurred. And actually, I spoke to one of the guys that both survived. One went back to work, one didn't. The guy went back to work. He said it was like a whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It was 3 waves that hit them. Now, this particular chap, he was on his knees at the time, and he turned around and crawled back out. And when he got outside, the webbing on his BA had melted. The visor on the helmet's melted. The helmet's polarising, his coat's polarising. He's burnt. He's in a mess. He turns around. His colleague's not there. So you know what he does? He turns around and goes back in.
Good man.
I mean, that's just the most amazing thing. And in the condition he was in, he would have had every right to say, hey, somebody else go in there, get my colleague out. So he's gone inside. The chap that didn't come out initially was standing. So he copped a higher intensity blast.
Yeah.
There's a photo that shows a dent. He was blown to the side of the hallway, put a dent in the plaster with his helmet, and then fell into one of the rooms. This guy's gone in, grabbed him, and dragged him outside. But I'm thinking, my God, it's just so close. It's almost 2 more firefighters killed.
Yeah.
Now, by this stage, there was a documentary called Under Fire. Have you ever seen it?
I have not seen it, but I'm going to make a note of it now.
You've got to see it. You've got to see it. Made by Discovery Channel. And this had aired, and it had gone right around the world. And it had aired in Brisbane in probably about 96. And a lot of people had seen that. And it was actually John Taylor featured in the documentary. So basically what this film crew have done is they've gone to Sweden. They've looked at what Krista's been doing there. They interviewed Nissa Bergstrom. They did all this expose on fire behaviour and development and the way it's being done in Sweden, and then compared it to the UK. And there was, actually a lot of people were very embarrassed about it, but it was a real catalyst for change. I think that was produced around about 94, 95.
Yeah.
And it did drive a lot of positive change in the UK. So by this stage, that's been out a lot, and it's had a lot of. It really opened people's eyes. It's a great documentary. You can have a look at it, to the need for us to change and to do things differently. So, with 2 fatalities, 2 near misses, at that stage I was ready to put forward a proposal, and it was good timing. We'd gone through a number of reviews, as you do in the fire service every 5 or 6 years, and the organisation had changed to an authority, so it was the Queensland Fire and Rescue Authority. The new chief wanted to be seen to be progressive, so as a result of that, I ended up getting approved in 1997. I went over to Sweden and the UK and looked at how, they'd be managing that change over the previous decade.
So when you first started making those travels, was this connections you were making through email? Were you just calling people up? Because, at this stage, were you still just a firefighter, or what rank would you have been? Or was it common practice for people to go and take these sort of leaves of absence to bring knowledge back to the service?
Well, I was just a grubby subby. We had substation officers and station officers. I'd been a substation officer for a number of years and had no aspirations of even becoming a station officer. I was happy being a grubby subby. So yeah,
it's still that really that's another step in your career. Well, when was the first inkling that you wanted to progress into that? Because you're only 8-9 years into your career here.
Yeah, so actually, when I came back from Sweden, I think around about 99, there was things that were changing. The structure was changing. I thought, I suppose I should move up to station officer rank. So I did that. I think I was a subby for about 10 years before I went up to station officer rank. I preferred the subby rank because you could actually get more hands-on. Okay. Back then, the station officers were expected to stay outside, whereas the subbies could go in with their crew and get dirty, get hands-on, and that's something I've always loved. And the role changed a little bit, so I could see that by becoming a station officer, I wouldn't be stuck outside with a clipboard. I was able to go in, so that was impetus for me to move forward to that rank. But that's as high as I ever aspired to.
It's interesting that a lot of people didn't want to progress to the higher echelons, because people will hear and they'll look at your story and stuff like that and they'll think, wow, perfect, chief officer material. But it's always interesting to see how far away from the coalface people want to get and what their drivers are. Because you retired at station officer, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, dizzy rank of station officer.
No, mate, 100%. That's probably where I think I'll end up. People keep encouraging me to go for my station officers now, but I just think it's too early on in my career, and I don't want to stop doing the instructing side of stuff, because once you become a station officer over here, you no longer be able to be an instructor. I currently work in our training department, and I'm absolutely loving it. It's such an incredible experience to be able to have people.
That's the same for me, Pete. That was my motivation. I wanted to stay at the pointy end and operational, and that's why I held off for so long before I became a station officer. Only when the role changed and it allowed that more flexibility that I moved forward. So I hear you, and I commend you for it. I think you've got to be. You've got to be where you're happy. And I know I've got many colleagues that have retired as senior firefighters, bright people, could have been anything they wanted to be, but they were happy at that role.
Yeah.
And happy to stay operational. So power to them.
Hey folks, just wanted to jump in with a quick piece around firefighter health and well-being. Whether you are trying to join the fire service and pass them tricky fitness tests, if you are currently serving, or if you are coming up to that next chapter of your life, retiring from the emergency services, we get so many different questions around it. So in partnership with Fitness for the Frontline, we have come up with a series of guidance and programs specifically designed to reflect the physical elements of the role of a firefighter. So whether it's carrying an LPP across an overgrown field, lifting a ladder above your head under running it, or wrestling with cutting gear for 30 plus minutes at some kind of complicated RTC, our bodies are required to lift, push, and carry objects in very specific circumstances. That is effectively what Fitness on the Frontline focuses on, as well as the longer term aspects of overall health and wellness for our firefighters. Now, we are definitely not about to be smashing out world records or getting that beach body ready in 6 weeks rubbish. The systems and programs that we put in place are adjusted for people's current fitness levels, and they're not a prescriptive weight or a one-size-fits-all BS. It is very likely for myself personally that I'm still going to be a firefighter when I'm 60 plus, so longevity in the role is really important to me, and I know it is for so many people out there. It all starts with no obligation, 7 days worth of the programming, absolutely free. So whether you're joining, serving, or looking at the next chapter in your life, Fitness for the Frontline is designed by firefighters for firefighters. Now back to the show. So talk to me about those first stepping outside of the service. Obviously, you'd seen this documentary, you'd made contact with a few people. When was the first time you travelled? Was it Sweden? Was it the UK? What did you see? And what were the first sort of big realizations that things were very different in other areas of the world?
Well, at that stage, the internet was relatively new. And making an overseas phone call was a big deal. You had to have a special, line. It was expensive, and internet relay chat was the closest thing you'd get to communication. So it was really in the early stages of that IT revolution. So a lot of it revolved around, magazines, buying books, reading books, and I had the librarian. We had a fantastic library, and the librarian always kept me in mind. And she'd send me these articles. Out of the blue. She said, I thought you might be interested in this. So that was how I sort of got a lot of my connections and a lot of my information. But so the study tour primarily was about firstly going to Sweden to see the origins, to look at how it had developed. And I got to meet Krista Giselson, and later on, years later, before I didn't, until I met Nils and Nisa and Mats Rosander. But I had spoke with the original people, and they were just fantastic to me. I was hosted by Uppsala Fire Service. They had a fantastic training centre there. I spent 2 weeks there, and then they really opened doors for me right throughout Sweden. And I did Järfälla, Stockholm, Rosersberg, did all the key centres at the time. And then I thought, well, that's great. The Swedish culture is a real can-do culture. The Australian culture is very much like the British culture. We're really safety focused and slow and steady. We love the documentation and rah rah rah. So I thought, well, I need to go to the UK to look how it's being adopted into the UK. And what I found in Sweden, it was sort of like almost passed down from father to son. There wasn't a lot of high quality written material back then. And that's just not part of our culture. If we're going to teach something, we've got to have a manual, and we've got to have a PowerPoint.
Was there any big differences in their operational approach though that you saw when you were over in Sweden in the way that either they utilized the equipment or the tactics or techniques that they used?
Well, yeah, there were some really big differences. Although I suppose not massive. If you're comparing Sweden to the US, massive differences, because the exact opposite ventilation philosophy is employed. In the US, it's very much open up and things get better.
Yeah.
Isn't always the case. In Sweden, it was they keep everything closed and things will stay good. So somewhere in between is reality. But they'd really adopted the teachings of Krista and Mats Rosander and Nisa. So that was they were very disciplined, very impressive fire service. They worked with what they called it was a three-person team. I'm trying to think of the name of the team. And they had a BA commander and their two firefighters. So basically what they do, they take their BA control to the entry point. So the BA commander would be fully kitted up. He wouldn't be on air, but the mask would be on his shoulder. Mm-hmm. And he would actually do BA control from right at that entry point. So really high level of supervision.
Wow.
With
Okay.
the BA teams. That was one thing that stood out. Their high risk procedure, how they secure their water supplies. They won't just take a line off a pump. They'll take a line off to a collector or church, they call it, and then they'll get an independent supply into that one there. So if this pump dies, the other one will kick in. And they're really thorough. The way they did their hose lays and their teamwork, and the way they had high risk procedures. So if they had to go a long way inside of a building, they'd have the team halfway through securing the line of retreat. So really interesting strategies and tactics they were using back then, and still, I think, still using those basic practices now. So that was one of the things that stood out. But really, the UK Fire Service were doing some amazing things. By 95, 96, when I was there, it was really starting to accelerate. So John Taylor had been a real catalyst. He'd stirred up the pot, and as a result of that, Richard Chitty and the Home Office did some research, and they had to admit, yeah, okay, we're not really where we could be. So that was a big admission. So he'd stirred up that, and it was really, there's some great change occurring, and they'd formed working groups probably around about 94, and look, by 98, some of the stuff they'd achieved was mind-blowing. They'd really leapfrogged, and they'd taken that occupational health and safety approach, the documentation, the manuals to a new level. And so by the late 90s, what they'd achieved in probably about a 5 or 6 year period was just mind-blowing. And then, the UK Fire Service seemed to go in a different track. Late 90s, there was massive change there, and austerity measures and cost cutting, and it's unrecognisable today from what it was back in the late 90s. Really is a very different service.
John Taylor, did he author Smoke Burns?
Yes.
Yes, I know he's on my hit list. I've got him
John's
down,
an amazing guy.
Yeah, the name was screaming through my head when you were saying it there, and I'm going to make contact again with John. So yeah, for people that
I really owe John a lot.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. So
really
he did a lot of the air track management stuff, and he's got a website, smokeburns.com, so people can go there.
Yes. Yeah. Look, John's left a real legacy there. Probably hasn't received the recognition he deserves. Because John's a little bit like Krista. If you ask him what he thinks, he'll tell you. And not everybody can handle his directness and his honesty. But some people love him for it's like Krista. Some people loved him when they hated him because if you asked him a question, you get an honest answer. And some people really admire that. Other people can't handle it. So
what was it like bringing those concepts back, to Australia and really starting to get an understanding for concepts such as, like we were alluding to earlier with those incidents, flashovers and backdrafts? And how soon were you able to, was it a case of trying to, a little bit of copy and paste from some of the British stuff in terms of documentation and trying to structure those newer manuals of firemanship? Was there much pushback around these new concepts, and how was it adopted?
Yeah, well, I was actually expecting a lot of pushback, but I think that the shock of losing 2 colleagues in Southport Honda, the near misses in Rockhampton, and that documentary Under Fire really had us questioning the way we were doing business. So I actually was received quite well. I didn't get a lot of pushback. There was actually very little pushback. Mostly people were open to the new ideas. Mostly, 90% I'd say were open to the new ideas, and so that part of it was quite good. But we had a long way to go. I mean, it was 97, and at that stage they were going to put a bulldozer through our training centre. They're going to build a new one. So I had a green field. We leased some land off the refinery there, and basically they said, "There it is, Shan. There's the floor plan. Dream big." So it was a great opportunity to be able to design a whole range of props, from the really basic compartment to the multi-compartment to external props, etc., etc. So yeah, it was a very, very busy time. 3 years of very, very intense. I think I burnt myself out, towards the end of it. But because it was an opportunity, I could see there was an opportunity to make change. We had the right people in place, and I could see that window was closing. The there'd been a political change and the fire service was being restructured. So I put a lot of pressure on myself to get as much done in that time frame as I could. But it was a really amazing time looking back. I don't think I could do it again, but I think the best part was 1999. So I got my Swedish instructor, Tommy Torney. He was my mentor in Sweden during the initial study. I got him over for a year. I managed to secure a secondment of a Swedish fire engineer for a year. And so Tommy and I worked very closely together. And he just look the depth of knowledge of these guys. And he can handle a nozzle like a first-class firefighter, yet has a depth of knowledge about science. And he taught me so much, gave me such a depth of knowledge in the science behind all of the practical stuff. So that time I spent with Tommy was just an incredible learning experience. So great times.
So had you moved fully into the training department by this time?
Yeah, well, it's funny. When I was on the plane flying over to Sweden, I think, what have I done? I mean, I couldn't believe it. We'd got to the point where it had been approved. Here I am on a plane and think, I've just signed my life away. I'm never going to go back on shift again. I'm going to be stuck in training for the rest of my life. I'm going to owe them for the rest of my life. And but anyway, like after 3 years, I burnt myself out. The political climate had changed. There was a new regime. I'm thinking, I've had enough of this. I'll go back operational. And so, for the next 22 years, I spent most of my career just as a station officer on shift. Did a couple of projects in between the tunnels and Churchill Fellowship. But so I'm very proud of the change I was able to make in those time frames. But yeah, it's also it takes a toll on you as well.
What's kept you so heavily involved in the international side of it then? Because you're a very respected speaker, and people call for you to wade in and give your input on several things. And you've also written a couple of books. So I know you say that you went back onto shift, or you went back into that station officer role, but you've still clearly had an appetite to keep an involvement in a lot of the work that's been happening internationally.
I've just been really blessed to have people around me, a handful of people that have believed in me and encouraged me. I think, a couple of pivotal people, if they hadn't been in my life, I don't know where I'd be now. Jeffrey Van Kronenburg was a good friend of mine, and he really encouraged me and he kept me going. And like for 2000, I went back on shift and I was really, really washed out and burnt out, and the politics and things was changing, and it was a difficult time. So I was still a little bit low. But Jeff kept encouraging me, and by 2002, the interest was still there as strong as ever. I was getting my mojo back, and also during that time, I was helping other fire services around Australia with their programs. So they turned to me and say, Shan, how can you help us out? I mean, and John McDonough was one of those. So John and I made contact, I think, early 2000. And he used to pour his heart out to me on the phone with all the issues, all the politics. And so I helped John. And before then was South Australian Fire Service. I kept in contact with them. Then I'd helped Northern Territory. So I sort of kept in contact with colleagues around Australia. That kept my momentum going. And then around about 2003, the South Australian colleagues wanted to do their own study to us. That really helped me. I said, yeah, sure. So I wrote up a study tour, mostly the UK, Exeter and Cornwall and Devon and Marsh. And then Singapore on the way back. And I thought, oh, hang on, I might go along myself. So I self-funded. I paid for everything myself. So I went along with them for 3 or 4 weeks. That reinvigorated my knowledge again. I was able to see the changes in the UK. And that was 2003. And then around about that time, Paul Winwood and I were talking on a regular basis. And Paul said, I've got an idea for this book called 3D Firefighting. Would you be interested? I said, oh, yeah, I'd love to. And we got talking about it. And I said, well, there's 2 other people you should involve. And one's my colleague from New South Wales, John McDonough. John's got really gifted with graphic art and that sort of stuff. He's a natural presenter. And Ed Hart, who was a guy I've been in contact with, never met him, battalion chief from USA, but but really broad in his thinking and hungry for knowledge. So anyway, we linked up, and I'd met John. I'd never met Paul. None of us had met Ed. And we, over a period of about a year and a half, we wrote this book together. And never once met face to face during that whole process. It's all done by email correspondence. Yeah, wow. Yeah. And I think the first time all four of us were together was in Belgium, only about 6-7 years ago. So it was
bloody hell.
But yeah, it was quite a feat looking back at it. But that book was great for all of us, and it was published in 2005. I suppose that's when things really took off for me. It helped put me on the map, 3D firefighting. It was controversial in the States, still controversial in some quarters. But
how did you go about putting that together then? Was it just, did you have just a skeleton idea of all the areas you wanted to cover, and you kind of split them amongst yourselves? Or because I've certainly not written a book, and I know it's a tremendous undertaking.
Well, yeah, basically we sat down and said, what do we need? We want this to be a comprehensive manual, and I think we tried to be all things to all people. And I think if you're going to write to instructors, you can't write to chiefs. If you're going to write to chiefs, you can't write to firefighters. So we tried to do everything. And look, I think the book it's been very well received, and it's a good reference book, and people still refer to it today. But yeah, we just broke it up into chunks, and we all had our areas of passion and expertise and knowledge. And we'd write our chapters, then we'd throw it across to each other, and we'd edit it and delete it, and no, we won't. And sometimes we'd have meetings and say, no, you can't use that term. So we had a little fights, not fights, but discussions about terminology and backwards and forwards. But yeah, eventually we'd all peer reviewed each other's chapters, and when we had to reach consensus. And when we'd reach consensus about one chapter, bang, that's one chapter done. Then the next one and the next one. So, and that was the process, and that was published in the States by Fire Protection Publications. And I think it came out in 2005. I was over in Germany for Interschutz in 2005, and that's when it was released. So, and really, just from then, people just asked me to do stuff, and it just grew from there. Every year it got bigger and bigger. It's South Africa with Paul, I think, in 2005. Then I did quite a bit of work in Malaysia for the National Fire Service there. And you keep thinking, oh, well, I'll do it this year because next year there'll be nothing. But it just never stopped. And
really,
towards the end, I think 2019 was a crossroads for me, because I think I'd spent 4 months overseas. And I'm just thinking, I can't keep doing this. I mean,
how receptive was your service of having this much time off? Because there can be those aspects of people internally, feeling jealous, or not very favourable about the fact that you are going away and doing some development yourself.
It was the worst kept secret in the fire service, I think. Because of that jealousy factor, I didn't talk about it a lot. No. Of course, in the last 10 years with Facebook, you can't go anywhere or do anything without someone posting a photo of you. But, the first gigs I did, I just took leave. I got my annual leave, and we get long service leave. So after 10 years, you get an extra 13 weeks. So by 2019, I'd burnt 30, nearly 40 years worth of long service leave. I had no long service leave, no annual leave. I was doing shift exchanges. And so basically all of my leave time was spent overseas. And I was lucky towards the end there was a change in the award, and you could actually take leave at half rate. So I was almost out of leave by 2015, and the half rate came along. So, yeehaw. So if I wanted a month off, I had to burn 2 weeks leave. But then, of course, you only get 2 weeks pay.
Yeah. So
I sacrificed the money. But that allowed me to keep going. But from about 2015 to 19, I was averaging 4 months a year overseas. And the previous years, I was averaging 3 months. So it was just a lot of time away from home. And then by 2019, I think physically I can't do this again next year. So I was thinking of leaving in 2020 because I had so much work teed up. And then COVID came along. So I
Fuck yeah.
decided to stay another year or two. So and that was good again. It was actually pretty good. COVID was good to me in that regard because I think I was burning out. I was just doing so much around the place. But yeah, it's just been a fantastic experience. To
So
just
when you
word
look
of
at
mouth
places
and
like Malaysia and South Africa, having visited those parts of the world, what were some of the biggest differences you said there? Are they how much further ahead or behind the curve are they in terms of the way that they are, equipped and the way that they're supported? Was there any
yeah,
big learnings that you took away from seeing the wide spectrum of how different people
yeah.
operate across the world?
That's the wonderful thing, Pete. It's just such a privilege to be able to look at how another country does the same job. And I say it's about 80-20. 80% is pretty familiar, pretty much the same,
Mhm.
but 20% is like really different. And that's the part that's really interesting. And then you get into the cultural differences. Um, and I did my first contract in Korea, Republic of Korea, in 2015.
Wow.
And what a learning curve that was. I mean, because I'd worked in Malaysia, I got to understand that culture. I've worked in Thailand quite a bit.
Mm.
But then, so I'm thinking, oh, I know these Asian cultures, I'm all over this, and the Korean culture is different again. So massive learning curve there. In the last couple of years, I've been working with colleagues in Japan. So it's just, I just love it. It's just fascinating to see that 20% difference in how we basically get the same job done, but in a different manner.
Mm.
I just love it. It's fantastic.
Do you think there's as much of an appetite to do international consultation and things like that now that we're moving into a more technological age and a lot of this information is as accessible? Because I feel like, individuals such as yourself have been developed because you've gone through that cyclic learning process so many times through this kind of international exposure. And we saw a little bit of it. Recently, we had a bunch of people over to the UK, and you see things like FDIC and some of the big events that you see throughout the year. There is still an appetite to share that information, but I wonder if we have as many sort of secondments or people go in and spending 6 months in different organizations. Do you see that as something that is still an important part of what we do, or do you think actually the way that we share information now is just more of a digital age?
There's no substitute for getting together face to face.
Yeah.
And I think that it'll always be that way. There's different levels, talking on the phone is one, then video conferencing is another, but there's really nothing beats that face-to-face interaction. And it's the exposure after work is as important as the exposure during work. So it's in the evening when you're sitting down over a beer or two and talking about issues that sort of stuff comes out. You can only do that by getting together with people. So I
Mm.
think that's as strong as it's ever been. But I've just been very fortunate to have had these opportunities to do these things. But most of them have been in my own time and on my own coin. There's
Okay.
times when I've made a few rubles out of it, but
And so you should, to be brutally honest with you. I know that people struggle with that aspect of it. They struggle with, well, it should just be, public service and we should just be doing this for free just because you love the job. But actually, you've developed a wealth of knowledge and, what you deliver outside of that is you as an individual. I don't think you owe it to your service or anything like that. People struggle with that sometimes because, people don't join the emergency services typically to make lots and lots of money, but you should also be appreciated for the work that you've put in, all those personal sacrifices. Because I wanted to ask you as well, like, what was the cost of all of that time spent abroad? And I don't mean the financial cost, but that's time away from family, from friends, from personal relationships. That all that travel sounds very exciting to a lot of people, and even to myself. But there will no doubt have been a cost to you spending so much time away from home, cost out of life, no doubt.
yeah, I mean, I've only got the one child. My daughter, she's 24 now, but that's was some of the hardest parts of the whole thing is, particularly when she was little, before she started going to school. Um, it really was very hard leaving it because you can't get that time back. They're only
Mhm.
at that age once, and Yeah, that was the toughest. So I had to balance that up and make it up to her. But I used to take her around. Some of the gigs I've done, she's come with me.
Wow.
For example, I went to I think I took her over to Germany with me in 2007, and we went from Germany to Croatia. So we were about 3 or 4 weeks. She was traveling with me there. I got her over to Malaysia for a couple of days while I was working in Malaysia. Then we went to the States. I was working with IFSTA on their fire ground support operations book. So I went in. That's right. I made it up. I went in 2 weeks early. So I took her to Disneyland, and then we drove across to Oklahoma, drove across the states through Utah, the Grand Canyon, over to Oklahoma, and then we flew from there over to the UK to Cambridge. The IFE meeting was on in Cambridge, so and then the way back we stopped over Singapore. So that was about 5 weeks that she was with me
That
then.
is an incredible experience to be able to share with your
Yeah,
daughter.
yeah, we've done some pretty cool stuff together, and but the biggest one was the Churchill Fellowship. She was about 11 or 12 at the time, and she's at that age where you want to take them out of school for 10 weeks, and but then this is an opportunity of a lifetime. So, we ended up taking her with me. So we did 2 weeks in New York, week in Canada, week in Germany, week in Austria, a week between Malmo in Sweden and Denmark. We went to Oslo, then Switzerland. So she's seen a bit of the world, that kid.
Talk to us about the
So,
Churchill Fellowship, what that was and how that came about.
well, that was my third attempt. So I'd had a go at a fellowship probably, I don't know, 12, 14 years before that, and didn't get past first base, and tried again a couple of years later and didn't get past first base. So I'd really given up on it. And then around about 2009, we went from virtually having no tunnels of consequence in Brisbane to having now we've got the three largest road tunnels in Australia, about 5 kilometres long. So that's going on. And then I'm also been asked to manage the implementation of compressed air foam systems. So they've said to me, "Oh, Shan, will you come into headquarters for a month?" No, 3 months. I said, "No, I'll give you a month. I'll come in for a month and get this CAPS stuff up and running, and then I'll go back on shift." Well, I've been there about a fortnight, and I said, "Oh, Shan, when I come to this meeting, there's a meeting on the tunnels. Would CAFs be any good in the tunnels?" "Oh, yeah, it could be good. Come along to the meeting." So by the time the meeting had finished, I'd found myself being asked to manage the operational preparedness for the new tunnel.
Bloody hell.
So I thought, oh boy, that's going to be like a year and a half. And I'm thinking, it was so interesting. It was a really, that was about halfway through construction. It was just so fascinating. So I thought, yeah, okay, all right, bite the bullet. I'm going to be here for a year and a half. And then I was really enjoying the project. And after a couple of months, I thought, you know what, this would be a good topic for a Churchill Fellowship. And a friend of mine from South Australia, Len Batley, was a Churchill Fellow. And I was talking to him, and I said, "Oh, I'll give it one more go." And he said, "Yeah, well, you should." He says, "It took me 3 attempts." I said, "Really?" I was quite amazed. He said, "Yeah, it was my third attempt before I got my Churchill Fellowship." So, right. I rolled my sleeves up, said, "I'll have another go at it." So this time around, it was successful. So that took me right around the world. It was about 10 weeks and about 8 countries.
So for people, including
just
myself, that are completely unfamiliar with the concept of a fellowship, what does it actually have to do to attain it, and sort of what was entailed within the completion of it?
Okay, so it's the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, and I think it's Canada, Australia, and the UK, the only countries that have got that trust. And it's designed to allow Australians to travel overseas to get knowledge and experience that can benefit Australia, that can only be gained overseas. So obviously, if there's a topic that's that you can learn within Australia, knowledge within Australia, then you're not going to get a fellowship. So it's about giving people opportunity to go overseas and study, and it's really diverse. Some of the people get fellowships for studying breeding or Bavarian bulls or something or other. So there's obviously there's a lot of medical fellowships. So
Yeah.
doctors are going over and studying new techniques, psychologists, music, art. So if you're at a dinner, a Churchill Fellowship's dinner, around the table it's an incredibly diverse group of people. And emergency services, they also have fellowships for emergency services as well. So just a really fantastic organisation. So what you have to do is convince them. You don't have a lot of words. You've got the application form, and you've got to be able to convince them that what you're doing is going to benefit Australia in some way, and that you can't get the knowledge in Australia. So I did up a good application form and application, good interview, and I was successful. And that was the fellowships generally are about 6 weeks, and they work out. You say I want to go here, there, and there. And there's like a daily rate for living in that country, and so they said there's a block of money, it's yours. They pay for the airfares, and then you get this swag of money, and they say spend it wisely, because if you run out, you're not going to get any more. So it's up to you then to manage that funding. So I managed to stretch mine out. I think it was about 10 weeks in total.
Wow.
I was travelling around, so yeah.
And then when you come back, is it just a case of you utilize that information with writing policies, or do you have to deliver a package of what you've actually learned? Or
so there's a Churchill Fellowship report that you have to present. That is, there's quite a bit of work involved in doing that. So it was an overview, basically, of what I saw in each country, what were the key points and lessons learned and that sort of stuff. So and that's your obligation to publish that. So I published that to complete my fellowship. Then after that, really as a Churchill Fellow, you've got an obligation to keep passing on that knowledge. So I've done a couple of conferences around the world where I've talked on the subject of operating in tunnels, firefighting in tunnels, and preparation and planning. And I've done a little bit of consultancy recently with the Snowy Hydro project and the Sydney Metro. So, yeah, I'm still involved. I'm still using that knowledge to make Australia safer.
take us there for a minute then. What are some of the main points that you tend to cover when it comes to firefighting in tunnels? Because this will be quite a foreign subject for a lot of people, to be fair.
Yeah. Well, it was certainly new to us. And we went from no tunnels to three the largest in Australia. But I tried to take my firefighter's hat off and look at it from different perspectives. So from a person who's constructing a tunnel, someone who's operating a road tunnel or rail tunnel, other emergency services. So I try to have a very broad perspective on the whole issue there, and saw a lot of diverse tunnel geometries. The New York Fire Department, they were just fantastic. I mean, that subway system over there is just, it's one of the biggest in the world. Definitely. And it's old too. It's got a bit of legacy stuff there. So I've got to look at that geometry. And I studied a train crash in Toronto. And then, so I was able to look at rail and road. And Switzerland, there's a training academy there called IFA, International Fire Academy. Just beyond belief. They've got 2 training sites in Switzerland, and they are by far the best tunnel training centres in the world.
Wow! If
you get a chance, have a look at them. And yeah, that was the last trip I did there. And they've got, obviously there's a lot of tunnels in Switzerland, Italy, and Norway, and they've got a lot of legacy constructions. So some of them are 15 kilometres, 17 kilometres long, and they're single tube, bi-directional traffic. Whereas we've got more modern tunnels. They're unidirectional. There's twin tubes and etc. etc. So I looked at every geometry from a hole that was dug in the ground 100 years ago, and you're lucky to have lighting in there, let alone exits, right up the really ultra modern stuff with fixed firefighting systems and state-of-the-art everything else. So it was very, very broad look I got at it. But the Swiss were really impressive, and their commitment to excellence in that area is just in a class of its own.
Yeah,
just staggering. They took me for a ride in their train. They've got a train that responds to emergencies in tunnels, and if you can imagine 3 you've got your main loco with the engine and everything else, and it's decked out with almost every break and enter heavy rescue tool you can imagine. Then multiply it by 2. The next carriage has got a 50,000 litre water tank, massive pumps, compressed air frame systems, all things to do with water extinguishing. And then the last carriage is pressurised. It's they can actually take people in there. They've got an onboard air supply, so they can take people into this carriage, and we've got about 30 people they can put in there, and they can triage them, they can treat them. They got enough compressed air to last for 24 hours. It just like, you can't describe it. And they've got 12 of them. 12 of these trains. Yeah, I think Germany.
So they would deploy them obviously deep into tunnels potentially, and be able to, firefight, bring people in on stretchers, BA, and all that sort of stuff, and then treat them inside their unit. That is incredible.
The capability. Yeah, you can't imagine, can you? I mean, and 12 of them. I think Germany had about 3 of them. Austria had 2. So the Swiss really are outstanding in their commitment to safety in those areas. But, they've got all these air supply points, quick fill, you can top up your cylinders, and they've really put a lot of thought into it. And the training centre is just in a class of its own. It's got road, it's got rail, it's got different geometries. And then the other site that actually bored into a mountain to make up that particular geometry. So different twin tube, single tube, road, rail, class of its own.
I wanted to just cover through, before we wrap it up, around some of the other books that you've obviously gone into around, the fire dynamics of firefighting, reading fire, fighting fire. What I want to I'm going to try and link in a few of these in the notes for the episode below. But I wonder if you could just take us into the sort of motivation for writing each of these, and why you sort of went into the detail that you did beyond 3D firefighting.
Well, I've been talking about writing a book on reading the fire for about 20 years now, and I haven't, I've written articles and journal stuff, but that 3D firefighting was the biggest I'd done for some time. It's actually Ben Walker got me into it. Ben said he was going to write these books, and so he asked me to review the first one. I spent a few hours there on that one there, and the next topic was, the first one was fire dynamics for firefighters, fundamental topic, and the next one was going to be reading the fire. So that's something I've been doing for 24, 25 years.
Wow.
Got a lot of material. So I said, well, let's make it a joint book, this one. And so I provided a lot of the material for that from existing training packages that I had. And then Ben added to that from his perspective, and then we collaborated on the third book, which was Fighting Fire. So, really massive projects, and Ben really inspired me. Otherwise, I'd still be talking about my next book instead of actually having written it. But really, if you want to understand something, you need to write it and teach it. If you can teach something, then you start to understand it, because it's when you start trying to explain something that you challenge your depth of knowledge. So it was a great experience to do those. And about 2 years ago now, I wanted to self-publish. I've been reading about self-publishing, and one of the things for 3D firefighting was it was very expensive. And I used to get an author's discount, and I was doing a course in Thailand. I said, look, I want to ship 6 books over to Thailand, and I want to ship 12, another 6 to Croatia. And it was like $500 postage for the one to Thailand. And I said, isn't there a cheaper way of posting? No, we only use this service because, if it gets lost, they got to replace the books. So it was going to cost me $1,100 to post 12 books to 2 countries. I thought there's got to be a better way than that.
It's not sustainable, is it?
And the book was about $100 and something by that stage as well. So anyway, long story short, we ended up self-publishing. So we've rewritten Fire Dynamics for Firefighters and Reading the Fire, and we self-published those. And it is just fantastic. A ton of work formatting it. I can assure you that almost broke me. But once you've got the manuscript ready for print, if you're in Italy, you just go online, or you just tell me, hey, I want a book. I order it, and it's printed. I've got US currency, US, Australian, Euro, and the pound, and I just picked the closest location, and they'll print one book and ship it out to you for like a fraction of what the
Wow.
traditional bookshops would charge you. Really, it just makes it accessible, because I didn't want to have a book that was going to be $120, $150. I wanted something that a tight ass fireman like myself would
Yeah,
be
that's it.
prepared to
You've got to
pay.
make it, able for your audience to be able to engage with it. That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah, so we've got the price down to, I forget what it is now, 42, something like that, or 37, yeah, 42, something like that. And that includes postage. And if people order several books, we can cut that back even further.
Mm.
But anywhere in the world, I just go in there and pick the local currency, and the shipping costs are very modest. They print it within 2 or 3 days. It ships out. Most places they get it within a fortnight. It's just
Love it.
awesome.
So what's the, I
So
mean,
we
we
wrote.
will put a link in the notes for this, but what's the best place for people to go to try and source this if they wanted a
Well,
copy?
we've version 2 of Fight Dynamics for Firefighters is self-published. Reading the Fire version 2 is self-published as well. So you can do a search and you can order it through Amazon, Kindle, wherever you want. So it's that's another fantastic thing about self-publishing. If you're in Zimbabwe, and you can order through the local Amazon store in Zimbabwe and get it shipped out. But they can also order it directly through myself or Ben if they email me. I can
Would you be
do print
happy
on
for us to
demand for them.
put an email address in a
Yeah,
contact? Are you sure?
yeah,
Because
sure.
I always
And
nervous
if the
about
people
doing
want
that
to
for
do two or
people.
three books,
Yeah,
look, no, we do a lot of that. We've done a lot of the sales have gone that way. And thing is that if they want to order 3 or 4 books, we can give them a discount. I can sort of say, okay, well, if you can order those, we can. Well, I can
I
do
think
that
that'd be
if
great things to
if
give
they.
to classes of
Mm,
recruits. Do you know what I mean? And I think people,
well,
if people did it 50-50, if service supported half of the payment, and then people, because I've got so many different books that I've purchased over the years, and I think it's been a great investment in my own personal development. And then the surrealness of actually being able to contact people such as yourself, and people were,
yeah.
I said it at the beginning of our
Well,
conversation,
the
people in the
IFE's
are
been a
very
good supporter.
receptive.
Yeah. IFE New Zealand, they bought about 30 books of us for that very reason, Pete.
Hmm.
To give them away as gifts for people that have done well in the exams. South Africa, I think I've sold about 50, 60 to IFE South Africa. So yeah,
Is the
they
IFE
get
an
quite.
international thing still? Because it's gone through different iterations, the Institute of Fire Engineers in the
Yeah,
UK. I
yes.
don't know whether
Mm,
the exams are still as relevant or popular in certain services, because we went through phases of making them a requirement for promotion processes and things like
mm,
that. But I
yes.
think that the content and their website and all that sort of stuff is great, and the references that they provide. But I don't hear it being put into certain services as like essential learning anymore, which I think is a shame, because it's a huge body of knowledge there.
Mm, yeah. I think there's still about 12,000 members across the world in many different countries and many different disciplines. If you go back to, well, I joined one in '83. It was one of the first things I did was join the IFA as a student,
Yeah,
and I've gone through all the examination processes, and I've actually been honoured enough to be awarded the title of Companion Fellow. So
bloody
I've
hell.
been heavily involved in IFE in Australia and internationally. So I love it. It's been great for me, incredible networking. But if you go back to the '80s, it was mostly senior fire service officers. It was driven by them and the upper echelons of the fire service. And there's always been the presence of engineering there, but it was sort of secondary. In the last 20 years, it's gone through a renaissance where its relevance in engineering, fire engineering, has really gone through the roof. So we're starting to see it dominated, and probably more members now are fire engineers because they linked up with the Engineering Council in Europe, and they're actually able to charter engineers. So, whereas years ago you did the graduate and you got GI Fire-E or MI Fire-E,
Yeah,
the way they restructured it 20 years ago now is when you do those, you then can use those as theoretical qualifications towards getting in engineering to being chartered
yeah.
or incorporated, etc. So you've still got to have the practical components to add to that, but they've so their relevance is probably as great as ever, if not more so. But I think
I think it's gotten much wider. Yeah,
towards,
the breadth of knowledge that is provided by the IFE is wider than it ever has been.
It's more focused on engineering now, the fire safety engineering, rather than firefighting. But there's still a strong presence in both disciplines across the world. And the USA branch, I think years ago they had about 24 members, but I think it's really taken off in the States. So they've got a couple of hundred or 1,000 members now, something crazy. So it's Hong Kong was the biggest branch outside of the UK, and I think Australia was number 2 at one stage. So, but that's another thing I love about the IFE is you're tapping into a network of people, all over the globe. All over the globe. And it was very good to me because actually John Taylor published a number of papers in the IFE journals. I think it was probably in 92. And that's what got my interest. And that's how I got in contact with John Taylor.
So many stuff I always need to revisit. I'm going to have to put them back. I've literally made 2 pages of notes of different people to go and speak to and different things to go and look at. And that's what I love so much about these conversations. But looking ahead now, that you're moving into this chapter of retirement, what do you think the next couple of years looks like for you? Because you said you'd built up this body of work and these contacts, but now you're kind of free. Now you've been released from that, but also, taking into consideration your daughter's in her 20s, she's maybe, starting her own sort of life as well. What does time look like for you moving forwards, and how long do you anticipate, being able to still travel and do some of these adventures?
Well, I've got about a 4-year plan. That's my plan, because after that, it'll be mainly theory I'll be doing from then on. But once again, the IFE has been very good to me. And if you look at people doing compartment fire behaviour instructors courses around the world, there's many different people doing it, and at the end you get a piece of paper saying you were there, and that's great. And but to me, I wanted something that was bigger than my credibility, so I actually went through the recognitions process through the IFE, and it's quite rigorous. So you have to present them all your policies and procedures, give them examples of written material, etc. So the big process, but that was successful. And in 2018, I was awarded a recognised training course. So, and that has really gone crazy. There's a demand for international recognition. So it's one thing to say, oh yeah, I did Shan Raffel course, he's a great bloke, Well, that doesn't really mean much outside of my circle of friends. Whereas at IFE, recognised training is bigger than me. It's an organisation that has a lot of credibility at stake. They don't give, and I have to pay for the rights to use that logo. I'm assessed and I'm audited and all the rest of it. So it carries the stamp of approval from an internationally recognised organisation. So that's been really good for me. And Israel's been fantastic. I've trained 2 groups of Israeli officers now, and they're really implementing the training programs that I've been promoting the last couple of years. So I'm taking great joy in seeing their success. Japan is also heading down the same track, Korea. So there's so many countries now that I've started to get a bit of a footprint in, and they're basing their whole curriculum, their whole training approach off this recognised training course. So I get a real buzz out of doing that.
Dude, that's such an exciting chapter of life heading into. And honestly, I just, circle back to the beginning of our conversation. I mean, just such admiration that you have this level of drive and excitement, and I can just hear it in your voice. Do you know what I mean? The hunger that you still have for this is truly inspiring. Sometimes when I hear people becoming disenchanted, or they're losing a little bit of love for it, sometimes I always say that you just need to put yourself around people, or you need to engage with people. You need to just widen your perspective a little bit. Sometimes if you narrow your world so far down that it's just the people that you're with on a day-to-day basis, then we can all get down in the dumps about the work. But when I hear people like yourself, I wonder if it's the fact that you've just been so open to what's happening in the wider world that has kept that almost childlike, with the greatest of respect, fascination with the sector.
It's true. I still get excited about it. I still love it. What gives me a lot of joy now is when I see my friends from Israel sending me pictures of the latest instructors course they've run, or my colleagues from South Korea. I mean, some of the stuff they're doing is just brilliant. They're just taking it to the next level. They're doing things that I only would dream about doing, and they share it with me, and then I share it with other people. And Japan, I'm excited about Japan because their culture, they're very disciplined culture, and they take things and they implement it in a very precise manner. So when I see those other countries picking up the baton, so to speak, and making it better, I'm thinking that's a good legacy. And every time I get an email from them or I see a post, it keeps me going.
Beautiful. Absolutely love it, my friend. Well, look, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I know we tried to get this chat together a couple of times, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day, especially on a weekend, to have this chat. I would love to revisit this maybe in 5 or 6 months' time, when you've been able to revisit these places now that we're free to travel and you're able to get out there again.
Yeah. Oh, Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. I'm very honoured, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great.
Thank you for your time, my friend. I really appreciate it, and I will speak to you soon.
All right, Pete. Thanks very much, mate.
Firefighters podcast is put together to develop, inspire, and hopefully even motivate those individuals who have chosen to serve our communities and be part of the first responder family. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield. If you have enjoyed today's episode and you want to see the podcast continuing, please head over to our Patreon page where you can support the ongoing efforts of the podcast. Please hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on whatever platform you're listening to. Please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.